The little girl living inside one of the richest mansions in Chicago was slowly dying, and no one knew why. Every week, expensive doctors arrived at the estate. They checked her blood, her heart, her lungs. They ran every test money could buy. And every single time, they left with the same answer. Nothing was wrong. But the child kept getting thinner, paler, weaker. She stopped laughing. She stopped playing. And soon, she was too afraid to even eat. The strangest part? Her father was one of the most powerful men in the city. A millionaire feared by everyone in Chicago's business world. A man who could buy anything, fix anything, silence anyone. Yet under his own roof, his daughter was quietly fading away. The person who finally uncovered the truth wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a bodyguard. It wasn't anyone rich or powerful. It was a poor young maid who had only worked in that house for 4 days. And what she discovered behind those beautiful mansion walls would break a father's heart and nearly cost her life. If stories about courage, family, and standing up for what's right mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We share powerful stories like this every day. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The morning Jolene Whitfield first stood outside the iron gates of Thorn Estate. The wind coming off Lake Michigan cut through her thin coat like a knife. Jolene stood on the sidewalk clutching a small piece of paper with an address written in smudged ink. Lake Forest, Illinois. She had read the address at least 10 times during the bus ride, afraid she might be in the wrong place. Because the mansion in front of her didn't look real. Tall iron gates. White stone walls. Perfect gardens trimmed like something from a movie. Beyond the gate stood a massive house with shining glass windows and polished marble steps. This was the home of Sawyer Thorne, one of the richest men in Chicago. And Jolene was a girl who had grown up with nothing. Her shoes were worn down at the heels. Her coat was second-hand and too thin for winter. At 27 years old, she already carried the tired eyes of someone who had lived too many hard years too early. Jolene never knew her parents. She grew up in foster homes, moving from one house to another like luggage nobody wanted to keep. Some families ignored her. Some shouted at her. Some made sure she knew every day that she didn't belong. There were nights she went to bed hungry. Nights she slept with the light on because she was afraid someone would lock her in a closet again like one foster father used to do. But there had been one good person in her life. An older foster mother named Dorothy. Dorothy had been the only adult who ever looked at Jolene like she mattered. The only one who hugged her and said, "You deserve a better life than this, sweetheart." But 3 months ago, Dorothy died in a hospital bed. And she left behind something Jolene could barely understand. A $50,000 hospital bill. Jolene could have walked away. But she didn't. Dorothy had loved her when no one else did. So Jolene took every job she could find. Cleaning houses, washing dishes, doing laundry. Anything that paid a few dollars. When she saw the job listing for a housekeeper at Thorn Estate, she knew it might be her only chance to pay off even part of that debt. The iron gate buzzed. A tall man stepped out of the guard booth. He had broad shoulders and a hard face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. "Name?" he asked. "Jolene Whitfield," she answered quietly. The man looked down at a clipboard, then back at her. This was Cade Brennan, the head of security for the Thorne family. He studied Jolene for a long moment the way someone might study a stranger before deciding whether they were worth trusting. Finally, he opened the gate. "Rules are simple," Cade said flatly. "Do your job. Don't wander around the house. Don't ask questions." He paused and looked straight into her eyes. "And if you see something you shouldn't, pretend you didn't." Jolene nodded. She had learned long ago that poor people survived by keeping quiet. She stepped through the gate. The long driveway led across white stone toward the mansion. Every step she took made her feel smaller. Everything here was perfect. Too perfect. The floors inside gleamed like mirrors. Fresh flowers sat in expensive crystal vases. Not a single speck of dust anywhere. But something about the house felt wrong. The air felt cold. Not winter cold, but the kind of cold that comes from silence. Heavy silence. The kind that feels like a secret hiding behind every door. The cook, a kind older woman named Rhonda, met Jolene in the kitchen and showed her the servants' rooms downstairs. Before leaving, Rhonda gave her a long look filled with quiet worry. "Just do your work," she said softly. "And try not to upset the lady of the house." Jolene frowned. "Who's that?" Rhonda hesitated before answering. "You'll find out soon enough." Then she added something that made Jolene's stomach tighten. "This house looks beautiful, but don't let the beauty fool you." The next morning, Jolene woke before sunrise and started cleaning the grand staircase. That's when she heard it. A small cough. Weak. Fragile. She looked up, and at the top of the stairs stood a little girl holding a worn teddy bear with one missing eye. The child looked about 8 years old. But she was so thin, she looked closer to 6. Her expensive velvet dress hung loosely from her tiny shoulders. Her skin was pale. Her eyes were tired. And as Jolene watched the girl slowly step down the staircase, trembling with each step, one quiet thought filled her mind. Something was terribly wrong with this child. And before that day was over, Jolene would begin to understand just how dark the truth inside this mansion really was. But what she discovered next would shake her to the core. Jolene lowered the cleaning cloth in her hand and stepped closer to the staircase. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice echoed gently through the tall hallway, almost too loud for the quiet that filled the house. The little girl froze on the step. For a moment she just stared at Jolene, her big eyes cautious, as if she were trying to decide whether this stranger was safe. Jolene gave her a small, warm smile. "Careful there," she said. "Those steps can be tricky." The girl didn't answer right away. She tightened her small hand around the railing and slowly continued down, one step at a time. Jolene noticed the slight tremble in her legs, the way she paused after every step like she needed to gather strength. When the child reached the bottom, Jolene knelt slightly so they were closer to eye level. "I'm Jolene," she said gently. "I just started working here." The girl hugged the worn teddy bear against her chest. Up close, Jolene could see how fragile she really was. The bones of her shoulders pressed sharply against the thin fabric of her dress. Her cheeks were hollow, and dark shadows circled beneath her eyes. The child looked like she hadn't slept well in a long time. "My name's Bria," the girl said quietly. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. "Well, Bria," Jolene said softly, "it's nice to meet you." For a brief moment, the girl's lips twitched like she almost wanted to smile. But then her eyes shifted nervously toward the dining room. Almost immediately, the tiny spark of warmth disappeared. "I have to go eat breakfast," Bria said. The way she said it didn't sound excited the way children usually talked about food. It sounded like a chore. Jolene watched her walk slowly toward the dining room. Breakfast had already been set on the long oak table. Everything looked perfect. Fresh fruit neatly sliced. Toast stacked on a plate. Warm milk in a glass pitcher. Bowls of cereal, honey, peanut butter. The kind of breakfast most families could only dream about. But when Bria climbed onto one of the tall chairs, something strange happened. She didn't reach for the food. She just sat there. Quiet. Still. Staring down at the table like she was waiting for permission. Jolene stayed near the doorway pretending to polish a silver tray. Then heavy footsteps sounded from the staircase. Sawyer Thorne entered the dining room. Even without introductions, Jolene immediately knew who he was. The man carried an aura that filled the entire space. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. His hair was slicked back neatly, and his sharp eyes looked like they had seen too much of the world to ever trust it again. He sat down at the head of the table and unfolded a newspaper. "Morning," he said in a low voice. Bria looked up immediately. "Good morning, Dad." The way she said it was polite. Careful. Not the carefree voice most children used with their parents. More like a student speaking to a strict teacher. Sawyer nodded once and turned the page of his newspaper. Then another set of footsteps entered the room. Genevieve. She looked like someone stepping out of a luxury magazine. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her silk dress soft and elegant, her makeup flawless even this early in the morning. She carried a plate of fruit and set it gently in front of Bria. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said sweetly. Her voice was warm, loving, almost too perfect. "Eat up," she added with a soft smile. "You need to stay pretty and healthy." From the doorway, Jolene watched carefully. Everything about the moment looked like a perfect family scene. A rich father reading the paper. A beautiful stepmother caring for the child. A quiet breakfast in a luxurious home. But Jolene noticed something small. Something no one else seemed to notice. When Genevieve leaned closer to Bria, the smile on her lips stayed sweet. But her eyes turned cold. Just for a second. A sharp glance shot toward the girl. Bria immediately picked up her spoon. She lifted it slowly to her mouth. But Jolene noticed something strange. The girl didn't swallow. She only touched the spoon to her lips, then lowered it again. A few seconds later she repeated the motion. Pretending to eat. Jolene felt a tight knot form in her stomach. The little girl wasn't eating. She was acting. Sawyer folded his newspaper and stood up. "I'll be late tonight," he said calmly. He leaned down and kissed Bria lightly on the head. "Be good." "Yes, Dad," Bria said quietly. Sawyer grabbed his coat and walked toward the door where Cade was already waiting outside beside a sleek black car. The front door closed. The engine started. And the moment the car disappeared down the driveway, the energy in the dining room changed. The warmth vanished. Genevieve's smile faded instantly. She glanced at Bria's untouched plate. Her voice was no longer sweet. "Finish your breakfast," she said sharply. Bria lowered her eyes. "Yes, Mom." She slowly lifted the spoon again. But her hands trembled. A few minutes later Genevieve stood and walked out of the room without another word. The silence that followed felt heavy. Bria remained sitting at the table alone. The enormous dining room suddenly looked too big for such a small child. Jolene stayed by the cabinet, pretending to organize dishes. But her mind was racing. Why was the girl so thin? Why was she pretending to eat? Why did she look so frightened of her own stepmother? The questions followed Jolene the entire day. By afternoon, she was assigned to clean the upstairs bedrooms. The hallway upstairs was quiet and carpeted so thick her footsteps made no sound. As she pushed the cleaning cart past one of the doors, she heard something. A faint rustling. The door to Bria's room was slightly open. Jolene paused. She hadn't meant to look. But something inside her made her lean closer to the crack in the door. What she saw on the other side made her heart drop. Bria was sitting on the floor beside her bed. And in her hands, the little girl was desperately unwrapping a piece of bread hidden inside a napkin. She began eating it quickly, like someone who was afraid the food might be taken away at any second. The little girl ate the bread in small, hurried bites, her fingers trembling slightly as crumbs fell onto the carpet. It wasn't the way a child enjoyed food. It was the way someone ate when they were afraid the food might disappear. Jolene's chest tightened. She had seen that kind of hunger before. Years ago, in a foster home kitchen where she once hid under a table just to finish a piece of toast without someone yelling at her. The memory hit her so suddenly it almost knocked the air from her lungs. Bria finished the last bite and wiped her mouth quickly with a napkin. Then she froze. Her eyes lifted. And suddenly she saw Jolene standing in the doorway. For a second, neither of them moved. The girl's face turned pale with panic. The remaining crumbs slipped from her fingers onto the floor. "Please," Bria whispered, her voice shaking. "Please don't tell my mom." The words came out so fast they almost tangled together. "She'll get mad. She'll say I'm bad. Please don't tell her." Jolene slowly stepped into the room. Her heart felt heavy, but her voice stayed calm and gentle. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling down so she wasn't towering over the child. "It's okay." Bria looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. The kind of eyes a child gets when they're expecting punishment. Jolene picked up the fallen crumbs and brushed them gently into the napkin. "You're not in trouble," she said quietly. Bria didn't answer. She just watched Jolene carefully, like she didn't quite believe her. Jolene leaned back slightly and spoke again, keeping her voice warm. "Everybody gets hungry, sweetheart." The little girl lowered her eyes. "My mom says eating too much is bad," Bria murmured. Jolene felt a small ache in her chest. "What do you mean?" Bria twisted the corner of the napkin between her fingers. "She says good girls don't eat like poor people," the girl said quietly. "Good girls know how to stay small." The words sounded rehearsed, like something the child had repeated to herself many times. Jolene swallowed slowly. "That's not true," she said gently. Bria looked up again, confused. "Food is good for you," Jolene continued. "Food helps your body grow strong." The girl frowned slightly. "But Mom says if I get big, Dad won't think I'm pretty anymore." For a moment, Jolene couldn't speak. The words hit something deep inside her. She had heard sentences like that before. Different voices, different houses, but the same poison. Adults turning hunger into shame. Turning children into something small and quiet so they wouldn't cause trouble. Jolene reached out slowly and brushed a strand of hair away from Bria's forehead. "You listen to me," she said softly. "You're already perfect exactly the way you are." Bria stared at her as if she had just heard something impossible. No one had ever said that to her before. Not like this. Not in a voice that sounded like it meant it. The girl's eyes softened for a brief moment. But then she quickly glanced toward the door. Fear returned to her face. "You won't tell?" she asked again. Jolene shook her head. "I promise." Bria relaxed just a little. Not fully, but enough that her shoulders lowered slightly. "Thank you," the girl whispered. Jolene stood up slowly. As she pushed the cleaning cart out of the room, her thoughts raced. Something was very wrong in this house. And it wasn't just a child who refused to eat. Later that night, the mansion grew quiet. The lights dimmed one by one as the staff finished their work and disappeared into their rooms. Jolene was wiping the last of the counters in the hallway when she heard a voice drifting from the study. "Genevieve." The door was slightly open. Jolene hadn't meant to listen. But the sharp edge in Genevieve's tone made her stop. "I'm telling you, Mom," Genevieve was saying into the phone. "Sawyer doesn't see anything. He believes every word I say." There was a pause. Jolene stood frozen near the corner of the hallway. Genevieve continued, her voice no longer sweet. "I can't stand that girl. Every time I look at her I see his dead wife staring back at me." The words made Jolene's stomach drop. "She's always there," Genevieve went on bitterly. "Always reminding him of someone else." Another pause. Then Genevieve's voice lowered. I just need her to change a little, become easier to deal with. Jolene's hands slowly clenched around the cloth she was holding. The woman inside the study let out a quiet laugh. Don't worry, Genevieve said softly. I know exactly how to handle children. Jolene's heart began to beat faster. Something about the way she said it felt wrong. Cold. Calculated. A moment later Genevieve ended the call. Jolene quickly stepped away from the hallway before the door opened. She walked back to the servants' quarters with slow, heavy steps. Her mind was spinning. The way Bria had eaten that bread. The way she pretended to eat at breakfast. The strange rules about food. And now Genevieve's bitter words about the child. Jolene sat on the edge of her bed in the small room downstairs. For a long time she stared at the floor. Fear whispered inside her. This wasn't her business. This was the home of one of the richest and most powerful men in Chicago. People like her didn't interfere in families like this. People like her stayed quiet, did their jobs, and kept their heads down. That was how poor people survived. But another voice inside her refused to stay silent. It sounded like Dorothy, the only person who had ever told Jolene she mattered. Sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest choice, Dorothy used to say. But it's the only one that lets you sleep at night. Jolene closed her eyes. Then she slowly exhaled. Because deep down, she already knew something terrible was happening to that little girl. And if she didn't pay attention, no one else in that house would. Upstairs, the mansion settled into the quiet of the night. But somewhere down the hallway, behind a closed bedroom door, a small child was awake in the dark. And a few minutes later, Jolene heard the faint sound of someone crying. The sound was faint at first, so soft that Jolene almost convinced herself she had imagined it. She sat still on the edge of her bed in the small servants' room, listening carefully. Then it came again. A quiet sob. Muffled, like someone trying very hard not to be heard. Jolene slowly stood. The hallway outside was dim, lit only by a few yellow wall lamps that cast long shadows across the polished floor. For a moment she hesitated. This wasn't her place. She had only been in this house for 2 days. But the crying came again, thinner this time, trembling like a small voice breaking under the weight of fear. Jolene knew that kind of crying. Children who feel safe cry loudly. Children who are afraid learn how to cry quietly. Her feet moved before she even made the decision. She walked slowly down the hallway. Each step careful. Each breath quiet. The sound led her to Bria's bedroom door. It was closed. Jolene stood there for a long moment, her hand hovering near the wood. The crying continued on the other side. Soft. Shaking. Finally she leaned closer. "Bria?" she whispered gently. The crying stopped instantly. For a few seconds there was nothing but silence. Then a small voice came through the door. "Miss Jolene." The way the girl said her name sounded fragile. Like she wasn't sure if she should feel relieved or afraid. "I heard you crying," Jolene said softly. There was a long pause. Then Bria answered quietly. "I'm okay." Jolene knew that tone. She had used it herself many times as a child. The voice people use when they want adults to leave them alone. But the tremble in the girl's breathing betrayed her. Jolene rested her forehead lightly against the door. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said gently. On the other side of the door the silence stretched. Then the small voice came again. "I had a bad dream." Jolene swallowed. "What about?" Another pause. Then Bria whispered something so soft it almost disappeared in the quiet hallway. "That mom locked me in the dark again." The words made Jolene's stomach twist. Her voice stayed calm, but her heart began beating harder. "What do you mean, Locked you in the dark?" For a moment there was no answer. Jolene wondered if the girl had fallen silent out of fear. But then Bria spoke again. "Yesterday, after the party." Jolene frowned slightly. "What party?" "The one with Mom's friends," Bria said. Her voice sounded distant now, like she was remembering something she wished she could forget. "They came in big cars and drank tea in the living room." Jolene remembered that afternoon. Genevieve's friends laughing loudly while Bria sat quietly by the window like a decoration. "What happened after they left?" Jolene asked gently. Bria's breathing became shaky again. "Mom said I embarrassed her," the girl whispered. "She said I looked weak and ugly sitting there." Jolene closed her eyes for a moment. A slow anger stirred in her chest. "And then?" she asked softly. "Then she took me downstairs." "Downstairs where?" "The basement." The word seemed to echo in the quiet hallway. Jolene felt a chill crawl across her arms. "There's a storage room down there," Bria continued quietly. "At the end of the hall." Her voice became even smaller. "There's no windows. No lights." Jolene's fingers slowly tightened against the doorframe. "What happened there, sweetheart?" Bria sniffed softly. "Mom told me to go inside." Jolene didn't speak. She let the girl continue at her own pace. "She said I needed to think about what I did wrong," Bria whispered. "And then she closed the door." The hallway suddenly felt colder. "How long were you in there?" Jolene asked. "I don't know," Bria said. "There's no clock." Another sniffle. "I called for her. But she didn't come back." Jolene could almost see it in her mind. A tiny child sitting alone in a dark basement room. Waiting. Crying. Hoping someone would open the door. "What happened after that?" Jolene asked carefully. Bria's voice trembled. "I got really scared. I thought maybe she forgot about me." The words cut deep. Jolene felt her throat tighten. "I kept knocking on the door," Bria said. "I promised I'd be good." Silence hung for a moment. Then the girl whispered the last part. "And then she opened it." Jolene exhaled slowly. "What did she say?" Bria answered in the same flat tone she used earlier when repeating Genevieve's rules. She said, "Good girls learn lessons." The quiet hallway seemed to swallow the words. Jolene stood there feeling a heavy ache settle in her chest. Behind this door was an 8-year-old child who had already learned how to accept cruelty as normal. She spoke again gently. "You shouldn't have to go through that." Bria didn't respond. After a moment the girl asked a small question. "Miss Jolene?" "Yes." "Are you still there?" "I'm right here." Another long pause. Then Bria whispered something that nearly broke Jolene's heart. "Can you stay for a little while?" Jolene leaned her shoulder against the door. "I can stay." The girl's breathing slowly began to calm. Minutes passed quietly. Finally Bria spoke again, her voice soft with exhaustion. "Miss Jolene?" "Yes." "Do you think my dad would be mad if he knew I get hungry?" The question hung in the air like fragile glass. Jolene felt tears sting her eyes. "No," she said gently. "Your dad wouldn't be mad about that." Bria didn't answer. Her breathing had grown slow and steady. The girl had finally fallen asleep. Jolene remained in the hallway for a long time after that, her forehead resting against the door. Her mind filled with 1,000 thoughts she couldn't quiet. Something terrible was happening in this house. And the more she saw, the more certain she became. But the real truth, the one thing that would change everything, was something Jolene would discover the very next morning, when she walked past Bria's room, and saw something in the mirror that made her blood run cold. Morning came slowly over the Thorn estate. Pale sunlight crept through the tall windows, touching the marble floors and long hallways with a quiet glow. Jolene had barely slept. The sound of Bria's crying had stayed with her all night, echoing through her thoughts long after the house had gone silent. By the time the first lights flickered on in the kitchen downstairs, Jolene was already awake. She tied her hair back, slipped into her work uniform, and started the morning chores. The mansion was still quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made every small sound seem louder than it should be. Jolene carried fresh linens up the staircase and turned down the long hallway toward the bedrooms. As she approached Bria's room, she slowed without really meaning to. The door was slightly open, just enough for a narrow strip of light to spill into the hallway. Jolene meant to keep walking. She really did. But something about the stillness inside that room made her glance through the crack. And what she saw stopped her in her tracks. Bria was standing in front of the tall mirror on the wall. The girl was still in her thin pajamas. Her bare feet pressed against the polished floor. In her hands she held a measuring tape. Jolene watched silently as the child wrapped the tape around her tiny waist. The numbers on the tape hung loosely against her body. Bria stared at the reflection in the mirror with a serious expression that didn't belong on the face of an 8-year-old. She pulled the tape tighter, then leaned forward slightly, squinting at the numbers. A small frown appeared on her face. Jolene's chest tightened. The girl looked disappointed, like someone who had failed a test. Jolene pushed the door open gently. "Morning, Bria." The girl turned her head. For a moment she looked surprised to see Jolene standing there. But she didn't look frightened this time. Not the way she had when Jolene caught her eating bread. Instead, there was something else in her eyes. Resignation. Like this moment was simply part of her daily routine. "Good morning, Miss Jolene," Bria said quietly. Jolene stepped into the room slowly. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Bria looked down at the tape in her hands. "My mom says I have to check every morning," she said simply. Jolene felt her stomach twist. "Check what?" Bria lifted the measuring tape again and wrapped it around her waist. "This." Jolene knelt down so they were at the same level. "Why do you have to do that?" Bria looked back at the mirror. "Because pretty girls have to stay small," she answered. The sentence came out smoothly, like it was something she had been told many times before. "My mom says if I don't stay thin, I won't fit into the dresses she buys me." Jolene slowly reached out and gently loosened the tape from the child's waist. The girl didn't resist. She simply watched Jolene with those quiet, tired eyes. "You don't need that," Jolene said softly. "But Mom says." "I know what she says." Jolene held the tape in her hand for a moment, then set it gently on the dresser. She placed her hands lightly on Bria's shoulders. "Listen to me for a second." Bria blinked slowly. "You are already beautiful," Jolene said. "You don't have to get thinner. You don't have to change anything." The girl looked confused. Her brows knitted slightly together. "But Mom says Dad likes pretty girls," she murmured. Jolene's heart sank. "And if I get bigger, he won't love me." For a moment Jolene couldn't breathe. The cruelty of those words settled heavily in the room. She swallowed hard before answering. "That's not true." Bria looked uncertain. Jolene spoke gently but firmly. "Your dad loves you because you're his daughter." The girl seemed to think about that for a moment. Then something small flickered across her face. Not quite belief, but maybe hope. Just a tiny spark. Jolene brushed the girl's hair back softly. "You deserve to eat when you're hungry," she said. "You deserve to grow strong." Bria stared at her quietly. Then she glanced toward the bedroom door. After making sure the hallway was empty, the girl leaned closer. "Miss Jolene," she whispered. "Yes. Can I tell you something?" Jolene nodded. "You can tell me anything." Bria lowered her voice even further, so quiet that Jolene had to lean closer to hear. "My mom gives me medicine sometimes," the girl said. Jolene frowned slightly. "Medicine?" Bria nodded. "She says it helps me stay light." Jolene felt a small chill run down her spine. "What kind of medicine?" Bria walked over to the bed. She lifted the corner of her pillow, and from underneath it, she pulled out a small clear plastic container. Inside were several white pills. No label. No name. Nothing to explain what they were. Bria held the container carefully. "She says I should take them when Dad isn't home," the girl whispered. Jolene stared at the pills. Her hands felt suddenly cold. "How often do you take them?" she asked quietly. Bria shrugged slightly. "Sometimes once. Sometimes twice. Mom says they help my stomach forget it's hungry." The room fell silent. Jolene's thoughts raced. Something about this was terribly wrong. She gently closed the lid of the container and placed it back beneath the pillow exactly where Bria had hidden it. Then she looked at the girl again. "Did a doctor give you these?" Bria shook her head. "No. My mom did." The words echoed in Jolene's mind. Her heart began to pound slowly, because suddenly all the pieces were starting to connect. The hunger, the weakness, the weight loss, the fear of food. Jolene stood slowly. Her voice stayed calm, but inside her chest a storm had begun to build. "Bria," she said gently, "today, don't take any more of those pills, okay?" The girl nodded. "Okay." Jolene forced a small reassuring smile. "I'll come check on you later." She stepped out of the room and closed the door softly behind her. The hallway felt colder than before. Jolene walked slowly toward the staircase. Her mind was spinning. If those pills were what she thought they might be, then someone in this house wasn't just controlling the girl. Someone was hurting her. And as Jolene reached the bottom of the stairs, she didn't notice that from the far end of the hallway, Cade Brennan was standing silently in the shadows, watching her, and wondering why the new maid looked like she had just uncovered something dangerous. Jolene walked down the staircase slowly, her hand resting lightly on the polished railing. Her thoughts were spinning so fast she almost missed the quiet presence at the end of the hallway. Cade Brennan stood there, half hidden by the tall shadow of a marble column. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, observing. Jolene stopped when she noticed him. For a brief second, the two of them simply looked at each other. Cade didn't smile. He rarely did. But there was something curious in his gaze, like a man who had just noticed a small detail that didn't quite fit the picture. "Morning," he said in his calm, low voice. "Morning," Jolene replied. Her voice was steady, but she felt the weight of the pills still sitting in her thoughts. Cade leaned slightly against the wall. "You look like someone just handed you bad news," he said. Jolene hesitated. She knew better than to speak openly in a house like this. People in positions like Cade's didn't ask casual questions. They asked because they were measuring you, testing you. "I'm fine," she answered. Cade studied her face for another second. Then he nodded once, like he had made a quiet note to himself. "Well," he said, straightening up, "if anything ever does look strange around here." He paused. "It usually is." The sentence hung in the air between them. Before Jolene could respond, Cade turned and walked toward the front entrance where Sawyer's car was already waiting. Jolene stood there for a moment longer. His words replayed in her mind. "If anything looks strange, it usually is." She exhaled slowly and continued toward the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air downstairs. Rhonda was already moving around the stove, humming quietly while flipping something in a skillet. The older woman glanced up when Jolene entered. "You look like you slept about 2 minutes," Rhonda said with a small smile. "Something like that." Rhonda poured coffee into a mug and slid it across the counter. "Drink." Jolene accepted the mug gratefully. The warmth felt good in her hands. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The kitchen was peaceful compared to the rest of the mansion. But Jolene's mind refused to settle. Finally she spoke. "Rhonda, can I ask you something?" Rhonda didn't turn around right away. She kept stirring the skillet slowly. "That depends," she said carefully, "on what you're about to ask." Jolene hesitated. She lowered her voice. "Bria, she's very thin." Rhonda's stirring slowed. But she didn't look back yet. Jolene continued quietly. "She barely eats." Still no response. "And she has pills hidden in her room." The spoon stopped moving. The silence stretched. Rhonda finally turned around. Her expression wasn't surprised. It was tired. Deeply tired. The kind of tired that comes from knowing something is wrong but feeling powerless to stop it. "So you saw that," she said quietly. Jolene frowned. "You knew?" Rhonda sighed and leaned against the counter. "I've been in this house almost 10 years, she said. "I see more than people think." Jolene's stomach tightened. "Then why hasn't anyone said anything?" Rhonda's eyes shifted toward the doorway instinctively, making sure they were alone. Then she lowered her voice. "You're new here," she said softly. "So let me give you a little advice." Jolene listened carefully. The last person who started asking questions about that child. Rhonda paused. "Didn't stay in this house very long." Jolene felt a chill creep up her spine. "What happened to them?" Rhonda shook her head slowly. "No one knows." The kitchen seemed colder suddenly. Jolene gripped her mug a little tighter. "But you know something's wrong," she insisted. Rhonda looked down at the counter. "I know the girl's getting thinner," she admitted. "I know she's scared of food." Her voice dropped further. "And I know the lady of this house has a way of making problems disappear." Jolene swallowed. "That's a child upstairs." Rhonda met her eyes. "I know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rhonda gently pushed the coffee mug closer to Jolene. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "You seem like a good person. That's exactly why you need to be careful." Jolene looked down at the dark surface of the coffee. Dorothy's voice echoed in her memory again. Sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest choice. She lifted her gaze. What if something really bad is happening to her? Rhonda's face softened. "Then God help that little girl," she said. The words hung heavy in the air. A few minutes later the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Genevieve appeared at the kitchen doorway. Her expression was bright and cheerful as always. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. Rhonda immediately returned to the stove. Jolene set her mug down. "Good morning." Genevieve walked slowly into the kitchen, her heels tapping lightly against the tile. Her eyes moved between the two women. Something about her smile felt practiced, carefully placed. She stopped beside the counter and picked up a glass. "Bria will be down soon," she said casually. "I want a glass of milk ready for her." "Of course," Rhonda replied. Genevieve opened the refrigerator and took out the milk carton. She poured it into a tall glass. Then something small caught Jolene's attention. Genevieve reached up to the cabinet above the counter. From the top shelf she pulled down a tiny bottle. Clear. Unlabeled. Jolene's heartbeat slowed. Genevieve unscrewed the cap and tilted the bottle. A few pale drops fell into the milk. She stirred it gently with a spoon. Her movements were smooth, practiced, like someone who had done this many times before. Jolene stood frozen. Genevieve placed the bottle back on the shelf and turned around. Her smile returned immediately. "Perfect," she said lightly. Then she picked up the glass and walked out of the kitchen to give it to Bria. Jolene remained standing beside the counter. Her hands had gone cold, because now she understood something terrible. The pills weren't the only thing being given to that child. And for the first time, Jolene realized she had just witnessed the moment the girl was being poisoned. Jolene remained still for several seconds after Genevieve left the kitchen. Her eyes stayed fixed on the empty doorway where the woman had disappeared with a glass of milk. The room felt heavier now, like the air itself had thickened. Rhonda noticed Jolene's expression and slowly lowered the spoon she was holding. "You saw it, didn't you?" the older woman asked quietly. Jolene nodded once. "She put something in the milk." Rhonda didn't look surprised. She only closed her eyes briefly, the way someone does when a truth they feared finally becomes impossible to deny. "I was afraid of that," Rhonda murmured. Jolene's heart began to pound harder. "Afraid?" she repeated. Rhonda leaned against the counter, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bria didn't start getting sick until a few months after Genevieve moved in," she said. "At first it was little things. The girl said she felt dizzy. Then she started losing weight." Jolene clenched her hands. "And no one thought something was wrong?" Rhonda gave a tired sigh. "Doctors came," she said. "Expensive ones. They all said the same thing. Stress. Appetite problems. Nothing serious." The words echoed painfully. Nothing serious. Meanwhile, the child upstairs was starving. Jolene's voice hardened slightly. "She's poisoning her." Rhonda didn't answer, but the silence between them said enough. Jolene knew she couldn't ignore this anymore. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked quickly out of the kitchen. Her footsteps were fast but quiet as she moved through the hallway toward the dining room. Bria was sitting at the table. The glass of milk sat in front of her. Genevieve stood beside the chair, smiling sweetly. "Drink it, sweetheart," she said gently. Jolene stepped into the doorway. "Bria." The girl looked up immediately. Genevieve turned slowly. For a moment the room froze. Jolene's eyes moved to the glass. "Don't drink that," she said. The sweetness vanished from Genevieve's expression. "What did you say?" Jolene walked forward. "I said don't drink it." Genevieve laughed lightly, though her eyes had grown sharp. "This is milk," she said calmly. "Are you trying to cause a scene in my house?" Jolene didn't look away. "Milk doesn't come with extra drops from secret bottles." The words hung in the air like a blade. Bria's small hands tightened around the edge of the table. Genevieve's smile faded completely. "You should remember your place," she said quietly. But before another word could be spoken, a deep voice echoed from the hallway. "What's going on?" Sawyer stood near the doorway. He had returned early. His presence filled the room immediately. Genevieve's tone changed in an instant. "She's making accusations," she said quickly. "Your housekeeper is being dramatic again." Sawyer's gaze moved slowly from Genevieve to Jolene. "Explain," he said. Jolene stepped forward. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady. "Your daughter is sick because someone is making her sick." Sawyer's expression darkened. "That's a serious claim." Jolene nodded toward the glass. "Ask Bria what she's been taking. Ask her about the pills under her pillow." Genevieve laughed again, but the sound carried tension now. "This is ridiculous." But Sawyer turned to his daughter. "Bria." The little girl hesitated. Then she slowly spoke. "Mom gives me medicine sometimes," she whispered. Sawyer's eyes sharpened. "What kind of medicine?" Bria looked at the glass. "She says it helps me stay small." Silence filled the room. Sawyer reached out and took the glass from the table. He smelled it. His jaw tightened. Genevieve's voice rose sharply. "This is insane. She's a child with eating problems, and that maid is feeding you lies." But Sawyer wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Bria. His daughter's thin arms. Her pale face. The way she shrank into the chair like she was afraid to take up space. And something inside him shifted. "Did she lock you in the basement?" he asked quietly. Bria's eyes filled with tears. "Yes." Genevieve snapped. "You're really going to believe a child and a housekeeper over your own wife?" Sawyer finally turned to her. And the room felt colder than it had all morning. "You told me she was sick," he said. Genevieve's confidence cracked slightly. "I was trying to help her." "By starving her?" The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a storm. Genevieve's voice turned bitter. "That girl is a reminder of your past. Every time you look at her you see your dead wife. I was tired of living with that ghost." The confession hung in the air. Bria began to cry softly. And Sawyer's face changed. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he dropped the glass into the sink with a sharp clatter. "Get out." Genevieve stared at him. "You can't be serious." Sawyer's voice rose like thunder. "Get out of my house." The woman's composure shattered. But the security guards were already moving toward the doorway. Genevieve's power in that mansion was over. Minutes later the front door slammed shut behind her. The estate fell into silence. Sawyer knelt beside his daughter's chair. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled Bria into his arms. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The little girl clung to him tightly. Jolene stood nearby, watching quietly. After a long moment Sawyer looked up at her. "You saved her." Jolene shook her head. "She saved herself by telling the truth." Sawyer exhaled slowly. "No," he said. "You were the only one brave enough to see what everyone else ignored." His voice softened. "Sometimes the richest houses hide the darkest pain." Bria looked up at Jolene through tearful eyes. "Miss Jolene." "Yes, sweetheart." "Are you staying?" Jolene smiled gently. "As long as you want me here." The girl wrapped her arms around her. And in that quiet moment, the mansion that once felt cold and silent finally felt like a home again. Because the truth had broken through the walls wealth had built. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply refusing to look away when someone needs help. In the end, love and kindness will always matter more than power or pride. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel. And tell us in the comments which region you're watching from.